The train hissed to a halt under a sky bleached with cold light, steam curling around the iron tracks like ghost breath. Clara Whitfield stepped off the last car with her chin lifted, coat buttoned high, and a worn suitcase in hand. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, her shadow long on the cracked wooden platform of Ironwood Hollow. Back in Illinois, folks had called her too much. Too tall, too direct, too proud. But she hadn't come all this way to be small. She came for a promise. For 6 months, she'd exchanged letters with a man named Thomas Avery, a sawmill foreman with neat handwriting and talk of steady income, quiet nights, and room to build a life. He never asked about her height. She never mentioned it. She'd hoped maybe that meant it didn't matter. But the man who stepped forward now, coat too fine, eyes already narrowing, spoke before she'd even reached him. "You're not what I pictured." Clara extended her hand, calm. "Mr. Avery?" He hesitated, shook it like it burned. "You didn't say you were so tall." "I didn't think it mattered." He looked away. "A wife ought to look up to her husband." Clara said nothing, just stood straighter. "I'll book your return fare," he muttered. "This won't work." And just like that, he was gone. She didn't chase him. She didn't cry. But her suitcase felt heavier as she walked through town alone, boots crunching into the frost-bitten dirt. Then a voice behind her, low and steady. "You're not lost, just not where you're meant to be yet." She turned. A man stood near the edge of the pines, axe slung over one shoulder, beard thick, coat worn. He was taller than her, broader too. His eyes were soft, not sorry. "Name's Reed Ashford," he said. "Lumber camp's just north of here. We don't measure people by inches. You need a place to warm up?" Clara hesitated, then nodded, because for the first time since stepping off that train, someone had seen her and not flinched. And that was enough to take the next step. The warmth hit Clara like a memory. Inside Martha Sloane's boarding house, the air smelled of wood smoke, fresh bread, and something faintly floral. The parlor was small, the rug worn, and the rocking chair by the hearth creaked like it had stories of its own. But after the wind-whipped platform of Ironwood Hollow, it felt like stepping into a kindness she hadn't expected. "Room's upstairs," Martha said, brushing her hands on her apron. "Corner 1. Bed's firm. Water's hot enough if you don't dawdle." Clara nodded, her suitcase still in her grip. "Thank you. I'll pay what I can until I find work." Martha gave her a look. "You'll help where help's needed. That's payment enough for now." No pity, just practicality. Clara liked her instantly. The room was small but clean, a slanted ceiling, a single window facing the pines, and a patchwork quilt tucked neatly over the mattress. Clara set down her case and sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling for the first time in hours. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried on the train, or when Thomas Avery's face shifted from surprise to embarrassment to dismissal. She hadn't cried when the train pulled away behind her, taking the last of her old life with it. But here, in this quiet room, she let her shoulders fall. Not in defeat, just release. She was tired, and she was still standing. Later that evening, she helped Martha set the table for the boarders, 3 loggers and an elderly schoolteacher named Miss Ruth. "You'll need boots suited for this terrain," Ruth said gently, eyeing Clara's travel-worn pair. "These hills don't forgive light leather." Clara smiled faintly. "I'll make do." Reed Ashford arrived last, his hair wine-tossed, his sleeves rolled. He nodded to everyone and took the seat across from Clara without fanfare. He didn't stare, didn't speak much either. But when Martha served stew, he passed the bread to Clara first. A small thing, but it anchored her. After dinner, Reed offered to show her around town the next morning. "I've got business at the supply store anyway," he said simply. "If you're looking for work, you'll want to meet Mr. Caro. He owns most of what needs mending." Clara hesitated. "You don't have to." "Not doing it for you," he said, then added, "Doing it because no one else will." She nearly smiled. The next day, the town looked different in daylight. Less like a rejection, more like something to be understood. Children ran between buildings, their laughter sharp in the cold. Men hauled timber down the muddy street, boots caked and backs bent. Women swept storefronts or strung laundry between clapboard walls. Every eye followed Clara as she walked beside Reed. No one said anything cruel, but silence can be sharp too. Reed didn't notice, or pretended not to. He spoke to the blacksmith, tipped his hat to the pastor, and held the mercantile door for Clara without looking at her like she was anything but a neighbor. Inside, Mr. Carroll squinted at Clara over the top of his glasses. "You the new boarder?" "Yes," she said. "She's a skilled hand with needlework," Reed added. "Martha vouched for her." Caro hummed. "Might have some repairs come week's end. We'll see." He turned back to his ledger. Clara didn't push. She was used to earning space inch by inch. That evening, as she swept the boarding house steps, Martha handed her a thick wool coat. "My husband's," she said. "He passed 2 winters ago. Always said the cold couldn't touch him. Still caught pneumonia?" Clara took the coat carefully. It was heavy, well made, with deep pockets and a collar high enough to guard against the wind. "Thank you," she said. Martha waved it off. "Does no good in the closet." But Clara knew better. That was the kind of gift people gave when they wanted you to stay. By week's end, Clara had mended a pair of trousers for one of the boarders and helped Ruth organize books for the schoolhouse. The work was quiet. So was she. But each stitch, each polite nod from a townsfolk, each shared glance with Reed at dinner, built something in her. Not quite belonging, but the beginning of it. On Saturday, a boy from town brought a bundle to the boarding house. "Mr. Ashford says these need mending. Camp uniforms, ripped at the seams." Clara took the bundle in silence. Inside, she found flannel shirts, torn cuffs, patched knees. The scent of pine and smoke clung to the fabric. She worked late into the night, not because she had to, but because someone had trusted her with a task that mattered. Sunday morning, Martha set a plate aside at breakfast. "For Reed," she said. "He's out hauling before dawn most days." Clara didn't think before she said it. "I'll take it to him." The walk to the logging camp was uphill, the trail slick with old snow and fallen needles. The trees stretched tall overhead, their branches sharp against the pale sky. Reed was by the shed, splitting kindling. He looked up as she approached. "I brought you breakfast," she said, holding out the plate. He set down the axe, wiped his hands. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. He took the plate, his hand brushing hers. Rough, warm. "You finished those shirts already?" he asked. "All but one." He nodded. "Good work." They stood in silence, the forest around them humming with wind. Then Reed said, "Most folks don't last long here." Clara looked up at him, the morning sun catching the edge of her jaw. "I'm not most folks." And something in his gaze, steady, quiet, told her he already knew that. The first real snow came on a Wednesday. It wasn't a flurry, not a warning. It was the kind that blanketed roofs and swallowed fence lines, that hushed the whole of Ironwood Hollow into stillness. By mid-morning, the boarding house windows had fogged with breath and stew steam. Clara stood at the parlor window, watching the flakes fall thick and steady. She should have felt trapped, but somehow, she felt steadier than she had in months. That afternoon, Reed returned from the woods early, boots heavy with snow and jacket soaked through. He stomped into the back entryway, shaking off the cold like it had challenged him to a fight and lost. Martha looked up from the hearth. "There's stew on the stove, and dry shirts in the basket." Reed nodded once. "Much obliged." As he passed, Clara handed him a folded towel without a word. He took it. Their hands brushed. He paused, looked at her. "Thanks." She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. The next morning, the wind howled over the hills and the trees groaned under the weight of white. Clara bundled herself in Martha's late husband's coat and ventured outside to sweep the steps. The snow fought back. It piled faster than she could clear, but she kept going. Halfway through, a second shovel appeared beside her. She looked up. "Reed." He didn't say anything, just started clearing beside her, moving in steady strokes, shoulder to shoulder. Together, they finished twice as fast. He nodded toward her boots. "You'll want better soles come January." She arched a brow. "I'll add it to the list." He smirked. "Just a little." At lunch, the loggers at the table joked about someone stealing Reed's breakfast that morning. One of them elbowed the other and said, "Maybe he's finally getting civil." Reed didn't look up from his stew, but when Clara refilled his coffee, he murmured, "Appreciate it." And that was enough. By week's end, a new bundle arrived at Clara's sewing table. No note, just shirts, flannel, torn elbows, a few bloodstains at the cuffs. She ran her fingers over the fabric, recognizing reeds among them. They were worn through but clean. Someone had tried to scrub them before bringing them in. She sewed late into the night, the fire crackling nearby. Each stitch felt like a conversation she didn't know how to start. Each mend, an answer she didn't know she was giving. Saturday afternoon, she walked the repaired bundle up to the logging shed. Reed was splitting logs again, steam rising from his collar. He looked up when she approached. Quicker than expected. "You weren't exactly gentle with them," she said, handing over the folded shirts. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. "Come inside," he said finally. "Out of the wind." She followed him into the work cabin, where the scent of pine sap and cold iron filled the air. A small stove crackled in the corner. Tools hung from the walls. It wasn't warm, but it was protected. He poured her coffee from a dented tin pot. No sugar, no apology. Clara sipped and nodded. "You do this for all the women who fix your sleeves? You're the first to fix them right." They stood in silence. Not tense, not awkward, just mutual. Then he said, "I was raised by a woman who never said thank you out loud." Clara looked over at him. "But you always knew when she meant it," he added. Clara met his eyes. "And you?" "I try to mean things more than I say them," she smiled. "I'm starting to understand that about you." The next morning, Martha caught Clara in the kitchen, buttering bread. "You two are quiet as snowfall," she said. "But folks are starting to notice." Clara paused. "Notice what?" "That you don't stoop around him." Clara blinked. "He doesn't make you feel like you have to," Martha added. "No," Clara said softly. "He doesn't." That evening, Reed knocked gently on the sewing room door. She looked up from her stitches. "Yes?" He stepped inside, holding something wrapped in linen. "I made this," he said. "Won't win any ribbons." He unwrapped it. A small wooden carving, a pine cone. Rough around the edges, but delicate in the details. Real effort, real time. "For your table," he said, "since you've made it your own." Clara held it in her hands, the weight of it surprising. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, lingering a moment too long before stepping back into the hall. When he was gone, she set the pine cone on the shelf beside her thread spools. Not because it matched, but because it belonged. That night, as wind battered the windows and the trees moaned outside, Clara sat by the fire with her sewing and thought about the man from the pines. He hadn't asked for her name when they met. He hadn't asked for anything. But with every gesture, coffee, a carved gift, a shovel in the snow, he had offered something rare, space. And in return, without even realizing it, Clara had begun to offer something back. Trust. The snow didn't melt, but the town's silence did. It cracked, it shifted, and slowly it turned into something else. Not warmth, not welcome, just a new kind of watchfulness. It began at the Dry Pine Mercantile. Clara stepped inside to collect thread and buttons. The bell above the door gave a sharp ring, and every conversation inside paused for just a second too long. Mrs. Hill, the baker's wife, offered a smile that was all teeth. "Still staying on at Martha's?" "For now," Clara said, chin steady. "She must be fond of you. Or maybe she just sees worth where others don't." A few heads turned. Clara didn't flinch. She paid for her thread and walked out into the cold with her spine as straight as the needles in her sewing basket. That evening at supper, one of the loggers joked too loud. "You keep sewing shirts for Reed, folks'll start saying you're measuring more than fabric." The room laughed, except for Reed, who set his fork down with a thud. "You say that again," he said, voice low, "and you'll be finding your own tailor. And your teeth." Silence fell like snow. The logger blinked. "Just teasing." Reed didn't smile. "Don't." Clara didn't say anything. She didn't have to, but her fingers curled tighter around her glass. The next Sunday, she walked to church alone. Martha had stayed back with a cough, and Reed didn't attend services, claiming he got enough reverence under pine trees. Inside, the pews were full. Eyes followed her up the aisle. She sat 2 rows from the front, alone. The sermon was about humility, The looks weren't. Afterward, in the vestibule, the whispers grew louder. She's bold, isn't she? Doesn't even wear a bonnet. Walks like she owns the place. She's got plans for that lumberman. Just you watch. Clara didn't respond, but her ears burned, and her jaw tightened. Outside, as she walked toward the boarding house, boots crunching through new snow, someone called from behind her. William Avery, the man who'd promised her a future, then vanished before her boots hit the dirt. Miss Whitfield, he said, all syrup and steel. You've settled in nicely. She turned. I've survived. Not that you noticed. He smiled, thin and sharp. Oh, I notice everything, including the company you keep. Reed Ashford isn't exactly the most discerning sort. Clara held his gaze unmoved. Maybe he doesn't judge a woman by her silhouette. Avery stepped closer, voice lowering. You think you found your place here? But Ironwood Hollow doesn't take kindly to women who speak too loudly or stand too tall. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. And men like you don't take kindly to women who don't flinch. His expression darkened. You've made a scene, Clara. Scenes have consequences. Clara's voice sliced through the chill. Only for people who think silence is obedience? He took one final step forward, too close. Don't mistake curiosity for respect, he said. This town watches everything. Eventually it'll turn. She stepped past him, slow and sure. Then let it. I'll still be standing when it does. And she didn't look back. That night Reed found her in the sewing room, fingers tight around a hem that had gone crooked. Something wrong with the fabric? He asked. No, she said. With the people. He waited. They think I'm too loud, too proud, too much. Reed leaned against the doorframe. Are you? She looked up. Do you think I am? He didn't answer immediately. He crossed the room, lifted the hem from her hands and examined the stitch. Straight, he said. Firm. Then he looked at her. So are you. Clara swallowed hard. He added, some folks only feel tall when they're making someone else feel small. She breathed just once. Thank you. He didn't smile. He just placed the fabric back in her lap. And that was enough. The next day, a small package arrived at the boarding house. A pair of gloves, wool-lined, handmade. Too large for most women, just right for Clara. There was no note, but when she looked out the window, she saw Reed loading logs into the cart, one glove missing. She smiled, and wore them that night to supper. Let them whisper. She had work to do, hands to keep warm, and a man who knew her size, not as a flaw, but as a fact. By Thursday, another seam tore, but this time it wasn't cloth, it was perception. Mrs. Blythe, town widow, matron of opinion, knocked on the boarding house door mid-morning, clutching a dress in her arms. I need it let out, she said. Too much pie, too little walking. Clara took the dress gently. No shame in that. Mrs. Blythe studied her. You're not like your letters said. I didn't write letters, Clara replied. Number. But I heard plenty about you. A pause. But I also see a woman who works hard, minds her business, and fixes what's broken. Clara waited. Mrs. Blythe nodded once. You'll do, and left. Later that evening, Reed knocked on her door. I heard what happened, he said. At church. With Avery, Clara looked up. He's not worth discussing. No, Reed said. But you are. She blinked. He stepped closer. You don't owe anyone silence. Sometimes silence is safer. Not always, he said. Sometimes it just lets the wrong people speak louder. She stood, taller than him, almost, but he didn't flinch. He never had. You're not a problem to solve, Clara, he said quietly. You're a presence, one I'd rather have beside me than behind. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply reached for the spool of thread on the windowsill and pressed it into his hand. If you're going to keep tearing seams, she said, you'd better start learning how to fix them. He smiled barely, but it was there. And in that moment, the whispers of a town held less weight than the silence between them. The wind shifted before the snow did. Reed had said it that morning with his usual quiet certainty, sipping his coffee while the clouds rolled in low and gray. Storm's coming, he'd murmured. He still went to the camp. Of course he did. There was timber stacked uneven at the northern ridge, and no one else knew how to brace it before the freeze set in. He left before dawn, coat drawn tight, axe slung across his shoulder. Clara stood at the doorway as he disappeared into the trees, something uneasy stirring in her chest. She didn't know yet that she'd be counting the hours by the tilt of the light, the depth of the silence, and the way no one had returned by sundown. The storm hit fast. Heavy snow, thick as wool, drifted down in sheets, blanketing roofs and swallowing sound. By mid-afternoon, the loggers at the camp had staggered back down the trail in twos and threes, soaked, silent. No Reed. Clara was in the parlor when the door burst open. A young man, barely old enough to shave, stood panting on the rug, his coat stiff with ice. "He's hurt," he said. "Mr. Ashford. Tree cracked wrong. Pinned his leg." Clara was already grabbing her scarf. Martha blocked the door. "Wait, where are you going?" "To get him. You'll never make it up the ridge in this storm." "He would." Martha opened her mouth, closed it, then stepped aside. "Take the lantern," she said quietly, "and don't be stupid with your bravery." The trail was nearly invisible, marked only by deep ruts and a few broken branches. Clara moved fast, one hand clutching the lantern, the other gripping a walking stick. The wind cut through her coat like knives. By the time she reached the camp, her cheeks were raw, her lungs burning. Inside the main cabin, Reed lay on a cot. Legs splinted with a crooked board, jaw clenched against the pain. He turned when he heard her. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "You shouldn't be stuck under a tree." She crossed the room and set down the lantern, her fingers already reaching for the bandages on the shelf. One of the loggers cleared his throat. "We weren't sure what else to do. Doc can't make it till morning." Clara nodded once. "I'll stay." They gave her space, as if everyone in the room understood that something more than injury was being tended to. She knelt beside Reed, pressing a warm cloth to his forehead. "You look worse than the tree," she said. He grunted. "You're a terrible nurse." "Lucky for you, I'm better with stitches than bedside manner." Reed's breath hitched as she tightened the splint, but he didn't complain. He just watched her. Eyes not glassy with fever, but with something else. Gratitude, or maybe something deeper. Night fell. The fire crackled low. Clara stayed at Reed's side, changing bandages, reading from the tattered book he kept by the bunk, feeding him broth when his hand trembled too much to hold the cup. At some point, he fell asleep, his breath evening out. Clara leaned back in the chair exhausted, but her heart was steady. She wasn't afraid, not of storms, not of snow, not of the way she felt with his hand resting near hers. Like maybe she'd stopped wandering. By morning, the worst had passed. Reed was lucid, sore, but stable. The storm had buried Ironwood Hollow in 3 feet of snow, but the sun had returned. When they finally helped him back down to the boarding house, 2 loggers holding him up like a makeshift sled team, Martha had already warmed blankets and cleared the parlor couch. Clara fluffed the pillow. "You didn't have to do all this," Reed said, jaw tight. She looked him in the eyes. "Yes," she said, "I did." The first night back, he barely slept. Pain, restlessness, the weight of stillness. It all gnawed at him. Clara sat across from him, sewing in the lamplight. "You should rest," he muttered. "You first." He shifted, winced, then looked at her. "You're not afraid of the mess, are you?" Clara's needle paused. "I've been called messier things." "That's not what I meant." She met his gaze, serious now. "No," she said. "I'm not afraid." "You could have walked away. Everyone else would have." "I'm not everyone else." That made him quiet. Then with surprising softness he asked, "Do you ever feel small?" She let out a breath, part laugh, part disbelief. "I've spent my whole life being told to be smaller, quieter, less visible. And now?" Clara didn't answer. She just reached forward and gently took his hand in hers. It was the first time she'd done it without needing an excuse. No tea, no bandage, no shirt to mend. Just her hand, in his. He didn't pull away. He squeezed once. That was all. But it was everything. Outside, the snow settled. Inside, something else did too. Not love, not yet. but something warm, something rooted. The kind of thing that doesn't burn bright and fast, but holds steady through storms. It began with a letter. Martha found it tucked in the folds of the morning paper, its seal heavy with red wax and a faint scent of pine tar. She passed it to Reed, who lay stretched out on the parlor couch, legs still stiff beneath a quilt Clara had stitched for him. Reed read it once, then again, then looked at Clara. "They're holding the town vote in 3 days," he said, "on the logging rights to the Southern Tract. Avery's pushing hard for expansion." Clara folded the laundry beside the stove. "And you?" "I've already said my piece, but I need to be there." She paused. "Can you?" Reed shifted, wincing. "I can stand." Clara gave him a look. "But can you stand up?" He met her eyes and nodded. The next day, the town began to buzz. Avery's supporters passed out flyers, promises of profit, of progress. He shook hands at the general store, spoke grandly at the post office, smiled too widely at anyone who hesitated. Clara watched from the boardwalk. Every time Avery caught her gaze, his smile turned tight. Like he knew, like he remembered. That night, the parlor filled with quiet tension. Reed sipped broth from a mug, staring into the fire. "I don't know what kind of man Avery thinks I am," he said, "but I do know what kind of land he'll leave behind." Clara sat beside him, turning a button over in her hand. "You've spent your life building something steady," she said. "He wants to make something fast." Reed looked at her. "You'd speak at the meeting, wouldn't you?" She blinked. "Me? You've spoken clearer than I have since the day you arrived." Clara laughed once, a low, surprised sound. "I've been called many things, but never someone worth listening to." "You are now," he said. She didn't answer, but the next morning she wrote down what she needed to say, and for the first time in years her hands didn't tremble. On the night of the vote, Ironwood Hollow's town hall filled to bursting. Men with soot-stained hands, women in worn shawls, children clutching their parents' coats. Everyone came, not because they wanted to argue, but because deep down they all knew what was at stake. Avery stood at the front, trim and polished. Reed sat near the aisle, one crutch braced between his hands. And Clara? Clara stood, straight-backed, head high, dressed simple but strong. She stepped to the front of the room with no one introducing her, no nameplate, no invitation, just her voice. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said. "You may know me, or think you do." Whispers stirred. She let them. "I came here with a suitcase and a letter. I was supposed to marry a man who decided I wasn't the right size to fit his picture, so I stayed in spite of that." A few glances shifted, some downward, some apologetic. "I stayed because I saw something here, a town with history, with trees older than any of us, with people who work harder than they're ever thanked for. But lately, what I see are men trying to carve up the very thing that gives this place meaning." She turned to the council. "You don't have to know me. You just have to know this. Quick money will not make Ironwood Hollow stronger. It'll make it hollow for real. And once those trees are gone, so is everything that makes this place more than a dot on a map." She paused, let it land, then stepped aside, and Reed stood, with effort, with pain. But he stood. "The land doesn't belong to men like Avery," he said. "It belongs to those who plant roots, who stay, who build." Clara's chest ached with something proud. The crowd stirred, a few clapped, a few stood, and Judge Morris, old and tired and steady, nodded once. "We'll vote now." An hour later, the results were posted outside the hall. By a margin of 12 votes, the council ruled against Avery's expansion. The room erupted, some in protest, most in relief. Clara stood in the cold, unreadable, until Reed came up beside her and said, "You did it." She shook her head. "We did." And then, without hesitation, she reached for his hand. He took it. No questions, no permission. Just fingers laced together in the open air, in front of everyone who'd ever whispered. Avery passed them as he left the hall, coat stiff with frost and pride. He didn't look at her, but Clara didn't need him to. She was already looking ahead. Back at the boarding house, Martha poured 2 cups of cider and handed one to Clara with a satisfied grunt. "You scared them," she said. "Good," Clara replied. "They needed waking up." Reed sat on the couch, leg propped up, the beginnings of a smile tugging at his mouth. "You're dangerous when you get going," he teased. Clara looked at him. "You'd better get used to it." "I plan to," he said, and the way he said it, plain, steady, sure, felt more like a promise than any letter ever could. That night, Clara lit a small oil lamp in her sewing room. She reached for her pattern book, flipped past the pages of designs, and tucked a folded flyer from the vote between the pages. A memory, not of a victory, but of a beginning, one she had helped shape, one she was ready to claim. The snow softened with each passing day, turning from ice-crusted mounds into heavy wet slush that soaked the boardwalks and darkened the pines. The town shifted with it, its pace slower, its voices warmer, as if winter had finally taken a breath. Clara no longer stooped beneath doorways. She no longer flinched at whispers. She no longer apologized, because somewhere between the storm and the vote, she had stopped surviving and started living. The boarding house felt different now. Reed's crutch leaned against the coat rack like a visiting friend. The parlor no longer felt like a sick room, but a place of shared silence and light. Clara still sewed in the back room, though now her mending was interrupted by neighbors who brought pie or children who came to fetch their father's patched overalls. And Reed? He was healing, slowly, stubbornly. He'd started walking without the crutch 3 days ago, just across the kitchen, just to reach the stove. But Clara had seen the way his hand brushed the doorframe for balance, and she had said nothing, because his pride was sacred, and so was her patience. One morning she found him outside, stacking wood with one hand and swearing under his breath. "You're pushing too hard," she called out from the porch. He looked up. "I've got a spine, not glass." "Spine's not much good if it's frozen solid," he smirked. "You always this bossy?" She stepped down the stairs. "Only when I care." That quieted him, in the way that mattered most. That evening he lingered in the sewing room. Clara stitched in the lamplight, her fingers working at a hem. Reed leaned in the doorway, watching her like she was a sunrise he'd never seen twice the same way. He spoke after a long pause. "I've been carving again." She looked up. "I remember the pine cone." He held something out in both hands. A small wooden figure. A woman, tall and straight, carved with rough reverence. Her hands weren't dainty. Her frame wasn't small. She wasn't soft, but she was strong. She was real. "She's not perfect," he said. "She's perfect to me." Clara took it gently and held it longer than she meant to. "Is this how you see me?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "It's how I remembered you, before I ever touched your hand." She set the figure on the shelf beside her threads. "Then it belongs here." He hesitated. "You could move it if you'd rather." "No," she said. "This room is mine, and she's a part of that now." She looked at him. "And so are you." 2 days later, the thaw fully arrived. Children ran muddy through the streets. Dogs barked with purpose again. The pine trees dripped. Life resumed. But for Clara, it wasn't a return. It was a beginning. That afternoon, Reed met her in the garden behind the boarding house. The ground was still hard but not frozen. He had a shovel. She had lilac roots she'd ordered weeks ago. "We plant these here?" he asked. "Unless you think I should take them somewhere else." He dug the first hole. She pressed the root down. Together they covered it with soil. Reed looked at her. "I want you to stay." Clara's breath caught, just slightly. "You've never asked me for anything," she said. He shifted, voice low. "Then let me ask now. Stay. For good. Not just at Martha's. Not just in Ironwood. With me." She turned to him fully. His hand still held dirt. His eyes didn't waver. "I'm not a man of speeches," he said. "But I've got a table with 2 chairs, a bed too big for one, and a name I'd give you if you asked." Clara stared at him, all the old walls rising, and then falling. "Say it plain," she whispered. "Be my home," he said, "and let me be yours." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. She stepped forward, took his hand, and laid it gently over the second lilac root. "I used to believe I had to shrink to fit into someone's life," Clara said softly. "But with you, I just grow." Then let's grow something that lasts, she said. And the next morning she hung her coat beside his on the porch rail. For the first time, it didn't feel borrowed. It felt like hers. That night, Clara placed her things back into her trunk, not to leave, but to put them away. There was nothing left to prove, and nowhere else she'd rather be. A week later, the town gathered for spring planting. The festival was small, children with ribbons, women with baskets of seeds, music from a fiddle that squeaked on the high notes. Clara wore a simple cotton dress she had made herself. She didn't try to hide her height. She didn't need to. As she walked past the general store, Mrs. Blythe stopped her with a warm nod. "You're not what I expected," the older woman said. Clara smiled. "That's the point." Further down the road, a young girl looked up at her, eyes wide. "You're the lady who stood at the meeting." "I am." "You were brave." Clara knelt so they were eye level. "So are you. Don't let anyone tell you different." When she stood again, Reed was waiting at the edge of the square, a basket of seedlings in hand. They walked side by side, like they always had, like they always would. And as the sun dipped low behind the ironwood ridge, lighting the sky in golden fire, Clara looked up at the peaks, then over at Reed. "You once asked if I ever felt small," she said softly. "I remember. I don't anymore." He reached for her hand. "Good. Because you were never meant to be. Not every woman fits the mold, and not every love story begins with a yes." Clara didn't wait to be chosen. She chose to stay, in silence, in storms, in her own strength. Tell us in the comments, what moment stayed with you the most? Have you ever been told you were too much? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing how far these stories reach. Maybe there's more to come. Tap like, subscribe, and share with someone who's learning to take up space.